The sky over the forests of Alsace, France, January 26, 1945, was gray as lead, and snow fell slowly over bodies that had not yet been buried, and over smoldering metal wreckage, sending up columns of black smoke that stained the whiteness of the snow. A lone American soldier, no tank, no artillery, not even the platoon whose bodies now lay scattered around him, stood on top of a burning tank destroyer. Flames were consuming it from below, and its fuel tank could explode at any moment and turn it into a ball of fire. But he did not move. He gripped a heavy machine gun mounted on that burning wreck and kept firing almost without pause, while 250 German soldiers advanced toward him, backed by 6 heavy panzer tanks, crawling through the snow like merciless metal beasts. 250 soldiers against one man, standing on a tank burning literally beneath his feet, fully aware that every extra second he spent there could be the last second of his life. He did not run. He stayed there for more than a full hour, bleeding heavily from his leg, his body shaking from cold and blood loss at once, speaking into the radio in a strange, calm voice, asking American artillery officers to shell his own position because the Germans had gotten so close that at times he could no longer tell his own gunfire from theirs. This man, who in that moment looked like a figure out of an ancient legend rather than a real war, was not a soldier of extraordinary strength, nor an imposing giant. He was, in truth, a thin, frail young man, no taller than 5'5", weighing barely 130 pounds, only 19 years old. His face still carried the features of boyhood, and only his eyes carried something different, something far older than his age. His name was Audie Murphy, and before we finish this story, you will know how a poor boy from the dusty farmlands of Texas, who never finished school and never owned a new pair of shoes in his childhood, became the most decorated soldier in the entire history of the United States Army, and one of the most contradictory, complex, and deeply human faces to emerge from the Second World War. Let's go back to the beginning, to where this whole story started, far from any battlefield, in a place that resembles nothing like a battlefield, except that it was its own quiet, daily battle for survival. Audie was born in 1925, in a rickety wooden shack the wind slipped through its cracks, amid the vast cotton fields of Texas, to a family of sharecroppers who owned neither the land they worked nor the shack they lived in. They were 12 children, crammed into cramped rooms, sharing meals that rarely stretched far enough for everyone, and sharing too a constant sense that the world outside simply did not care whether they existed at all. His father left the family while they were still young, simply vanishing one day and never returning, leaving the mother alone to struggle to feed mouths that never stopped being hungry. She worked in other people's homes, washed their clothes, and sewed her children's clothing from old flour sacks. Audie, still a child, woke before dawn to work in the fields, then went to school when he could, which was. His mother died while he was still a young teenager, and the fragile world holding that family together collapsed entirely. He left school for good at very young age, barely finishing the 5th grade, to work full-time and hunt rabbits and squirrels in the nearby woods to feed his younger siblings, who were later scattered among relatives and orphanages. He had carried a rifle since early childhood, not for play as other children might, but because every bullet meant the difference between a meal and none. Those harsh years, though no one knew it at the time, were quietly shaping something extraordinary and unmatched. Natural marksman, his eye was unnaturally precise, his hands steady even under the harshest conditions, and his patience endless when stalking target. He had learned a lesson from hunger. He would never forget a single mistake meant failing to feed the people he loved, so he never allowed himself to make one. But poverty alone, however harsh, does not make a hero in the sense the world would come to know. There had to be a bigger moment, a historic spark, to ignite that dormant fire and turn it into a flame that could not be put out. That moment came on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked the American base at Pearl Harbor, an attack that shook all of America to its core. Audie, not yet 16, rushed to enlist, driven by a mix of national outrage and a genuine desire to escape the cycle of poverty strangling him. But doors closed in his face one after another. The Army Air Forces rejected him for being too short. The Marine Corps rejected him too, for roughly the same reason: he looked too frail to carry a Marine's full combat load. Even the regular Army hesitated for a long time before accepting him. He looked too thin, too pale, too young for the horrors of real-world war. He asked his older sister to lie about his age on the official papers, and she agreed to sign as his guardian, claiming he was older than he actually was. The Army finally agreed to take him, even though at least one officer on enlistment day looked him over and predicted in an indifferent tone that he would not survive single week on a real battlefield and that he ought to be sent to work as a cook or a records clerk instead. That officer, like many others later, was completely and utterly wrong. In his early basic training, Audie collapsed from exhaustion more than once, his frail body unused to the long marches under heavy combat gear, and some of his bigger comrades mocked him, nicknaming him Baby or Junior. But once they put a real rifle in his hands and sent him to the firing range, everyone suddenly went quiet. His shots struck dead center again and again, with a precision instructors had never seen in a new recruit, as if years of hunger in the Texas woods had sharpened in him a talent that training alone could never buy. He was sent first to North Africa as part of the American campaign there, then to Sicily, then on to the Italian mainland itself in grinding, bloody battles. And in every engagement, he proved the same thing again and again: that physical size has nothing to do with true courage, and that the deadliest man on a battlefield might be the thinnest and the quietest on the surface. In one battle in Italy, Audie crawled alone under the cover of darkness toward heavily fortified German positions, dragging himself on his stomach across long stretches of mud and open ground, fully exposed to enemy fire, and destroyed several machine gun nests with little more than his bare hands and hand grenades, saving his entire platoon from a tight ambush that would have wiped them all out had he been even minutes late. He came back from that mission as though he had done nothing worth mentioning, refusing to speak of it in front of his comrades. Then came the invasion of southern France in August 1944, a major operation meant to open a second front to overwhelm German forces. There, Audie lost his closest friend, Laddie Tipton, the man he considered the older brother he never had in his broken, homeless childhood. He lost him right before his eyes, to a single German sniper's bullet that pierced his body in one swift, fatal instant. Audie could do nothing to stop. Something inside Audie broke that day, completely and permanently. An overwhelming grief turned into a quiet, cold fire, quiet and terrifying at once. Ignoring the shouts of comrades trying to stop him, he charged alone toward the position that fatal shot had come from, and killed several German soldiers with little more than his bare hands and his personal weapon, in a scene those who witnessed it later described as closer to a calculated fit of madness than to ordinary battlefield courage. He never spoke of that moment again afterward, not to his comrades, not even in his later memoirs, as if some part of him had been buried there alongside his friend. But everything before this, every scattered battle, every medal slowly accumulating on his young chest, was merely prologue, merely a preliminary chapter to what would happen on that bitterly cold day in January 1945, in the small, forgotten French village of Holtzwihr, marked on no one's map of the Great War, when he found himself, a young lieutenant leading a company nearly wiped out within just a few hours, facing a massive German assault wave that no sound military logic could expect anyone to survive. The battle was part of what would later be known as the Battle of the Colmar Pocket, one of Germany's last desperate attempts to hold a foothold west of the Rhine, before everything finally collapsed. The temperature was several degrees below freezing. Snow fell thick enough at times to blind visibility, and Audie's men, already exhausted from days of continuous fighting, began falling one after another before the advance of heavy German tanks and infantry. Audie ordered his remaining men, a small handful compared to the company's original strength, to fall back immediately toward the thick tree line of the nearby forest, while he alone stayed behind at the exposed front line, not out of theatrical heroism or a desire to be seen, as some might assume, but because he understood, with cold, simple logic, that someone had to slow the German advance, even by mere minutes, or everyone would die, his men included, for nothing at all. Audie climbed onto an already burning, abandoned American tank destroyer, its crew either killed inside it or fled wounded moments earlier, and grabbed the heavy machine gun mounted on top. opening fire amid thick black smoke and falling snow, while 6 German tanks advanced with terrifying slowness from different directions, and their infantry tried to encircle him from every possible angle, closing in like the slow jaws of a metal vice. Over the radio, his voice occasionally breaking from the cold and the pain, Audie asked the American artillery officer behind the lines to shell his own position, because the enemy had come within just a few yards of him. When the startled officer asked, with obvious concern in his voice, exactly how far the Germans were from him, Audie answered with total, almost absolute calm, as though discussing something perfectly ordinary. "Hold on a second, and I'll let you talk to one of them myself, so you'll know exactly how close they are." He kept fighting entirely alone for more than a full hour, wounded with deep, continuously bleeding gashes in his leg, surrounded by smoke, flame, and fire rising from the wreck beneath him, his limbs numbing from the bitter cold, until his ammunition ran almost completely dry, and the German assault finally broke, retreating in visible confusion, utterly frustrated by the stubborn resistance of one single man who, to them, had seemed like an entire fully armed battalion. When Audie finally climbed down from the burning wreck, ignoring those around him urging him to seek treatment immediately, he did not go straight for medical care. He first led his remaining men in a small counterattack that fully recaptured the position, before finally collapsing from blood loss and sheer exhaustion. When people later asked him, after he had become a well-known national hero, why he did it, why he risked his life to such an unreasonable, almost insane degree that no military logic could fully justify, he answered with a simple sentence, shockingly plain in its simplicity: "They were killing my men." For that day, Audie Murphy received the highest American military decoration of all, the Congressional Medal of Honor, adding it to an already staggering, remarkably long list of medals and honors that made him, before he had even turned 20, the most decorated soldier in the entire history of the United States Army since its founding. 33 medals and decorations in total, including nearly every award for valor the United States grants, in addition to French and Belgian honors in recognition of his role in liberating their lands. But the real story of Audie Murphy, the story few people know beyond those glorious moments on the front line, does not end with the roar of battle and the gleam of medals on his chest. When he returned home a hero, welcomed with flowers and massive parades in major cities, his face on the covers of famous magazines, there was another person entirely living inside him, a person quietly shattered behind the smile the media forced him to wear in every photograph. Audie suffered from what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time, it was not a recognized or medically acknowledged term. It was often seen simply as a personal weakness to be hidden rather than discussed. He slept with a pistol under his pillow almost every night, waking in terror again and again from battle nightmares that never left him, and suffered sudden fits of rage and chronic insomnia that stayed with him for many years after the war had officially ended. He said, with a rare honesty for his generation, in the few interviews he later agreed to give, that war does not end when the last bullet is fired in the last battle. It keeps living and pulsing inside whoever survived it, sometimes more violently than it ever did on the battlefield itself. He later became a Hollywood film star, drawing on his widespread wartime fame, and acted in dozens of films over roughly 2 decades, including a famous film retelling his own true story, titled To Hell and Back, in which he played himself on camera, reenacting some of the harshest moments of his life before an audience. Yet despite all that sometimes hollow cinematic glamour, he continued, until his sudden death in a small plane crash in 1971 at only 46 years old, to speak publicly and with rare honesty about the deep psychological wounds of war, trying, across all those years, to open a door for an entire generation of soldiers returning from different wars, so they could openly admit that fear and inner brokenness were not shame to be hidden, but the true cost of courage that never shows up ground despite that very fear. When everyone around you has fled or fallen, and when no one remains but you to make the only difference possible between life and death, for whoever is left of your own. In Gleaming Medals, the story of Audie Murphy, then, is not merely the story of one man standing alone atop a burning tank destroyer, against 250 soldiers armed with tanks and heavy weapons. At its deepest core, it is the story of a poor boy who lived through hunger and homelessness before he ever knew the taste of war, and who proved to the entire world that the greatest battles are sometimes fought not by the physically strongest or the most imposing, but by those who have nothing left to lose, except the men who had become the only real family they ever had. And that true courage, as Audie proved again and again, is not the absence of fear, as so many believe. It is standing your